Continuing our discussion on the Ukraine ceasefire, we turn to the view from Washington with veteran geopolitics commentator, WSJ's Jerry Seib. Jerry, thank you for being there.
Sure, happy to be here, Simon.
Does this change anything in the view, or will it change anything in the view from inside the Beltway?
Well, I think it's probably going to change one thing significantly, and that will make some of the critics unhappy. I think one of the things this does is it probably stops the conversation about whether the U.S. should be providing lethal aid to the Ukrainian government. You know, that debate was well underway, and in fact, it may be that the signs that President Obama was moving in that direction helped prompt the Russians to go to the negotiating table and get serious about this. The president indicated earlier this week he wasn't going to make a decision about that until he saw how this European overture to the Russians and the separatists in Minsk turned out. Now you have an agreement. It's difficult in the light of that to then turn around and say, well, now that there's an agreement, we are going to go ahead and arm the Ukrainians, though that's what a lot of people in Washington who are critics of the administration think ought to happen. So I think one of the early effects of this is probably going to freeze the let's send lethal arms to Ukraine conversation.
So what about the sanctions? Does this say, oh, sanctions worked? I know there's often a lot of skepticism about sanctions. Still, Putin is very popular at home, but he seems to have helped an agreement happen here.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of dispute that the sanctions work and have helped the process. Even the Europeans who are not thrilled with sanctions would probably agree with that. The real question is, again, do you go further? Do you produce more sanctions? Or could you do that in the West right now if this agreement falls apart? I mean, one of the things I'm sure Vladimir Putin had in mind was to prevent not only the arming of Ukraine, as I just mentioned, but to prevent the addition of sanctions on top of the ones already in place. That'll probably work for now, but I think the question on sanctions won't be, did they work? I think everybody will say, well, they did work. They helped produce a diplomatic agreement here. The question is going to turn to, if this falls apart and there's not a great trust of the Russians or the separatists in the West, if it falls apart, will the Europeans agree to turn to the sanctions question and toughen them up again?
That is a key question. There's also other key questions about how long it will hold. If we cast our mind back using a very long backwards telescope to the 90s, we saw the Bosnian conflict and a lot of ceasefires there, and basically none of them worked until there was U.S. military might involved.
Yeah. Well, and none of the Ukrainian ceasefires have worked up to this point either. I mean, you in the earlier segment, Simon, you talked about the skepticism already coming to the surface. I think there'll be a lot of that because there hasn't been a lot of faith in the West that the separatists in particular, or frankly Vladimir Putin, to really take their commitments under these agreements seriously. I don't know what would happen to make that attitude different this time. So, there is going to be a continuing debate about what kind of military pressure still needs to be applied. What kind of military help the Ukrainians need to make this agreement stick if you hope that it might have some chance of sticking?
Well, we'll see soon enough, won't we? Thank you very much, Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal.
Sure.